And we asked Canadians in 90 seconds or less, tell us why you should win $20,000 and the chance to travel coast to coast, camping and glamping at Hipcamp's most epic stays along the way. We got so many entries, close to 500,000 votes. And those were leads that we could then nurture. We had over 400 media hits. We were on TV, radio, syndicated online publications, print, and there were multiple storytelling moments throughout that campaign.
Welcome back to Horizons Podcast, where I convince marketers to sit down and share their secrets with the rest of us. Today, I'm excited to be here with Lydia Davey. Lydia is the co-founder of Attentio PR, where she helps the world's most interesting startups accelerate growth through high-impact earned media coverage. Her journey began as a U.S. Marine combat correspondent, built through a time working in communications at Apple, and most recently has continued through various fractional communication leadership roles at startups. Lydia, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
I'm curious to start at the very beginning. What drew you to join the Marines at 19 years old?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'd always known I wanted to be in the military. My grandfather served in the military during World War II. And I was in college and I was in the Marine officer program and I was so bored with school. And I thought, I'm ready to hop into some adventure. And I was also a little concerned with kind of how lazy I was. And I felt like I really need a force that's a lot stronger than myself to help me become the kind of person I think I probably can be, but am very incapable of becoming on my own. And so I moved from the Marine officer program to the enlisted program, and a few months later shipped out, went to boot camp, and then had a really kind of wild and interesting career in the Marines for about 6 years. And then, so that was that.
That's incredible. I love that hack of signing your future self up for something that's hard. I feel like that helps me a lot too. When I'm feeling lazy, okay, let me commit to this tomorrow, and then myself tomorrow will have to figure it out.
I love it. Yeah.
I'm curious, for becoming a combat correspondent, how did that happen? Was that your intention, or is that something that happened along the way?
I had always been interested in writing and journalism and storytelling. And when I walked into that Marine recruiter's office and they were going through the options, I was really surprised and delighted to find they had a combat correspondent billet in the Marines. And so, yes, I signed up for that. Thankfully, scored appropriately. It's the only job on the enlisted side in the Marine Corps that you have to interview for. And thankfully passed that interview, and then went to the Defense Information School in Baltimore, Maryland, and Fort Meade, Maryland nearby, and completed, several months of training to become a combat correspondent in the Marine Corps.
It's amazing. And I don't know about people listening, but I've heard of different people like Hemingway or other war correspondents. What is life like as a combat correspondent?
It's always changing. Every day is so different. Unlike any other job, the range of experiences is wild. I traveled to 36 countries across 5 continents. I saw, I'll never forget being under the sacred tree of Moamba in Mozambique and watching a witch doctor carry out an animal sacrifice during a military training exercise. And that was something else. Poor goats, poor chicken. And then one day you're in Afghanistan and you're volunteering to hop up into the turret and serve as a gunner during a convoy. And it's just, every day is radically different. But the fundamental of my job, of what I was there to do, which is storytelling for the Marine Corps, was the same. And so I liked that. It's like constant adventure and variety, and also some really important constant underneath it all.
That's incredible. What was your favorite assignment as a combat correspondent?
Probably my time with U.S. Marine Forces Africa. It was a new command, and a buddy of mine I was in college at the time, finished my first 4-year enlistment, and a buddy of mine called me and he said, "Hey, do you want to come fight pirates in Africa?" And I was like, that sounds great. I'm in. Back into the Marine Corps for a couple of years. And I lived in Germany, but I was constantly deploying down to the African continent. And I remember this really surreal moment of being, I was flying with this general down to Liberia, and we were playing Scrabble on an iPhone in a private jet over 20,000 feet over the Sahara. And I was like, this is the most like surreal and bizarre experience, but it was like a constant flow of those types of just like micro adventures, that just had a very surreal. I was like, I'm from like West Lafayette, Indiana. What am I doing here in the sky with the general playing Scrabble on this private jet? And it was the most wild. But I got to do a lot of traveling from there, all over Europe and to the Republic of Georgia on assignment, and Slovenia, and all over the African continent. So it was
It's
fun
incredible.
for that reason.
And then you finished your time in the Marines and immediately started Mariah PR agency. What led you to start a PR agency after the Marines?
Well, I went back to college to finish my degree, and during those final few years, I started looking at roles in civilian communications, and kind of realized I really, because of this kind of unconventional background I had in the Marines, I'd kind of be starting from scratch because I didn't have the experience that people who, traditional experience that people who've been in comms, might have 5 or 10 years in the civilian sector. But I thought I know how to bring a lot of value, but I don't see an in for a role that's going to pay me more than like $40,000 or $50,000 a year starting. And I didn't want to work my way up again. And so I thought, how can I immediately create value that will bring me the compensation I know I'm worth, compensate me appropriately for the value I know I can bring. And so I literally started cold calling businesses and learning about their experience with PR agencies, what they needed, what they liked, what they didn't. I took a course called How to Build a Lean Startup from Udacity, and it's taught by Steve Blank, and realized there's an opportunity for me here. And I think I can get business if I can bring the right offerings priced right to the table. And my research kind of guided me. And I was able to start and grow a 6-person PR agency. I moved to San Francisco to be close to startups and start to build out those relationships. Had an incredible time helping international startups launch to the US, and did that for several years before I was recruited over to Apple. So that was that journey.
Incredible. What a journey. Before I dive more into what it was like building a 6-person team, how you got your first client, I want to first explore what is communications in a nutshell for marketers like myself who might not be super familiar with it.
Let's see. I would think about corporate communications very differently than I would think about public relations. And since that's what I do 90% of the time now, I think about public relations, which is it's storytelling that sells. That's how I think about PR. There's so much I could say about, I don't want to get too far off the topic you had in mind, but there is so much I could say about the difference between kind of lining up facts and going out with them, which is what a lot of companies do, and telling a story that grabs the attention of someone's heart and mind and dollars. And that's the difference, I think, between sharing facts, talking about what you do, and actually telling a great story that converts into the results you're looking for.
What would be an example that comes to your mind of something where it's like, here are the facts, but then this is what it should translate to in a story?
So this is a really simple example, but it's one I loved. And here are 2 facts. The queen died, the king died. And then if you think about it in terms of context, that matters. The queen died, the king died of a broken heart. And then you have a story, and there's an emotional element to it. And I could talk about this, with potentially like a client story too, but I really think it's like getting to the heart. It's the right ordering of facts with exactly the right amount of context that makes people want to learn more. And it goes from something that's kind of neutral that you don't really care about to something that you have some curiosity about. And it's really just getting people to the next. Yes. Do you want to learn more? Sure. Yeah. What happened? And then suddenly I have 5 or 6 questions about this, and I'm hooked. I'm in the story.
That's incredible. And it's also very similar to sales in a certain way, where your goal is to get people to ask, okay, what's next? I want to know more.
Yeah, I could see that. Spin selling, really understanding. And I think this goes to PR as well. Understanding what are the implications of saying no to this product, and really helping people understand that for themselves versus through questions. And then how does saying yes to this immediately solve for all of those concerns? And you can do that through the right kind of storytelling, I think. So yeah, similarities with sales.
Would you say this storytelling element, is it more science in the sense of put the context in, find the curiosity, or is it more art and that you need to tweak with a few different storylines and then see what resonates the best?
Yeah. I think too often, like, PR is talked about or thought about as this kind of magical, dark art. And the reality is it's both. It's both a science and an understanding that goes beyond data of human psychology. And the best campaigns that I've run, the most successful campaigns that I've run, have absolutely been grounded in great research and understanding. And I can talk a little bit about that, but understanding really where are all the places this story could possibly live? What are all the possible expressions for each of the connection points? And being really diligent about understanding why each of these outlets might be interested in the story I have to tell, and what is the most compelling way for me to frame the client story for this particular outlet.
And you've done this at companies like Hipfan, where you landed major news articles. What would be the process of finding the story for Hipfan?
Yeah. Well, Hipcamp is a marketplace for, think of it like Airbnb for camping, although they hate that, but it is very handy for storytelling. So they've opened over 5 million acres of private land to create brand new places for people to recreate. And an example of, I think there's some data mining to do. If we're looking to just increase the volume of earned media coverage, one of the things I do is like, okay, where are some growth markets for us? And then take a look through what are some of our most interesting stories? And you wouldn't always find them in the listing or the listing description. Oftentimes you'd find them in the extras. So Hipcamp offers things like cold brew coffee delivered to your tent in the morning. In the case of one of my favorite stories from Hipcamp, I saw that it was near the fall, and I was looking around at the extras, and I saw that this grandmother had posted an extra Casey's pumpkin patch, and you could go in and you could pick a pumpkin for $1. And I was like, well, this is a really cute story. So I dug into it and I found out that Casey was a 9-year-old boy in Oklahoma. His dad had passed away from cancer, and he wanted to earn money to help his family. And so he planted this pumpkin patch. He watered it and weeded it daily. And his grandma let him have this land, and he worked his little tail off. And he had this little, rat tail and a little, like a cute little mullet and this rat tail. And he was just like the sweetest kid. And I called up the local news stations and I said, hey, at this Hipcamp, there's a little boy named Casey. He's 9 years old and he's selling pumpkins. And like, I feel like this is just such a great local news story. And it's this kid who's working so hard, to help his family. And I think your viewers would love to make a trip out to the pumpkin patch here at this Hipcamp. And it's such, Casey's a little compelling character. His grandmother's great. They've got these big longhorn cattle kind of wandering around the property and tent set up. And that was a great broadcast hit for us. And so I think it's looking for those little nuggets. And obviously it's a discrete example that's kind of outside maybe a broader strategy for, what are the the kind of messaging hierarchy we care about for this brand and how do we advance it. And but that's an example of, I think, using data in some way, which is understanding where are our growth markets, where do we want more people to hear about Hipcamp, and then getting really creative. It's the science and the art of landing that coverage and getting the brand in front of tens of thousands of people who otherwise would never hear about it.
Yes. And it's interesting to me, I don't know, my misconception probably of PR is that oftentimes it feels like you need to go to the journalist and pitch them on something. But in this instance, it's a very clear example of the journalist is probably looking for really cool stories to tell like this. Exactly. And you're doing them a big favor by being like, hey, there's this boy, you should go talk to him. It's a great story.
Yeah. It's really packaging. I think my background as a journalist in the Marine Corps really helps me because I'm always thinking like a journalist. When I write a email subject line, I'm writing the headline that I hope my client will get. And I'm really thinking about it like what matters to their audience, whether it's at TechCrunch or at this little local Oklahoma news station, and how can I make it a very easy yes for the journalist I'm talking to.
So then coming back to the start of your Mariah Creative, how did you get your first client?
So I had a much bigger idea at the time. I wanted to build a marketplace to match PR professionals to companies that needed PR support and to productize PR offerings. And so I let people know I was working on this big kind of hairy goal. And a friend of mine reached out and said, I have a colleague. She's looking for PR support. I know you're building something kind of different, but like, would you be open to chatting with her? And I was like, sure. And so that was my first, tiny little $2,000 project, but it was my start. And it came about because I had set a really ambitious goal and let people know that I was on my way. I was going to do this thing. I think communicating or like signaling your ambition as well as where you are today is just so helpful when you're getting started. It lets people know how to help you.
That is incredible. And I feel like the analogy that sticks with me often is when you're moving, you can adjust course. When you're not moving, you can turn the steering wheel, you can move the rudder, but there's no momentum. You're not going to adjust course.
I love that. Yeah, that's
incredible.
Really good.
So what would an average engagement look like in this case? So maybe taking this first one of 2000 or maybe something else. What does an engagement with a PR agency look like?
Well, I think you can kind of bucket them into two types of engagements. One is like a retainer-based engagement, and the other is project-based. And I love project work. And so I think the flow is the same for both. It's just how, do you have the budget to sustain a retainer and enough kind of brand communications and public relations needs that makes sense. But it starts the same, which is a deep dive into the objectives that the founder has. What do they want PR? What do they expect PR to be able to do for them? And do those expectations map to reality given the state of their offering? For instance, I've had clients come to me pre-launch and rolling out maybe a consumer product, and they're 6 months out, and it just doesn't make sense yet. But it will, 4 months from now. And is what they're offering net new to the industry? If it's kind of a copy and paste of what someone else is offering and it's just got a different name, I'm sorry, but like it's probably, you can get somebody to take your money without a doubt, but it's not going to be me because like the story's been told, and they're just kind of unless they're doing something like radically fresh, it's just not going to be something that's going to get traction. So we really have to exit that conversation understanding what is the heart of the story and why now? Like, why should a journalist tell that story today versus 5 months from now? Because if you don't have a strong why now, good luck getting coverage. So
that's fair. So it's not right for every company, but for certain companies, it's a very good fit.
Yeah, for certain companies, it's a very good fit. And I think because, thankfully, I've been able to be very choosy with the companies I work with. When I say, we work with the world's most interesting startups, I really mean it. And because of that, we have just a killer track record of ROI positive PR campaigns. And I think of this one client I worked with last year, Peace Vans. They were building out the first camper van conversion kits for Volkswagen's new ID Buzz, which is their fully electric, kind of reimagined minibus. And that was coming to the US. So Peace Vans, really interesting company out of Seattle, founded by a former Microsoft executive. And they didn't have a physical product when they came to me. All they had was kind of like renders. And they had no idea when Volkswagen was coming to the US. They had no idea if this massive investment they're making in building out these conversion kits was going to be worth it. But we talked a lot about like, okay, how do we time this? And what are our targets? Research showed me that, of course, like the automotives are like a very obvious place to go. And they're like 40 or 50 automotive publications. But beyond that, research showed me like, okay, there's a opportunity for lifestyle storytelling and placements here, design publications, outdoor gear publications, clean tech pubs. And so we figured out how to tell that story in the most compelling way possible. We ended up getting over 120 media hits at launch, and that's kind of continued to snowball into more and more coverage. They drove tens of millions in new revenue. They pulled no other marketing levers, by the way, just PR. And so I think that's a great example of, doing that research, thinking very creatively then about how do we tell the story to these variety of outlets? And then, you press go and the coverage rolls in, and so do the sales.
It's such a cool story. If you were starting a company and you're like this company, you're very beginning, and you have to decide, do I do marketing or do PR? Would you see PR as something that if you do the right things, you will get a result? Or is it more of if you do the right things, you may get a result, but also might just not work out and you should place your eggs in multiple baskets?
Well, if you work with me, it's low risk, okay? And here's why. Okay, here's why. Because 3 times in my entire career, I have not gotten a single media hit. And I have given refunds because I think if I can't do my job, I shouldn't get paid. And I also think I have really well-developed instincts about what makes for a great story. So if you're a founder, you're thinking about, do I invest in marketing or do I invest in PR? I think it really depends on what it is you're bringing to market. And I think it's worth looking at both. If you are bringing a slightly better, slightly faster, AI company or, some kind of widget or whatever to market, marketing is probably your best bet. But I think if you're bringing something net new to an industry, a product that people have never seen before, or something with a really interesting story, then PR could very well be your best bet. And it also doesn't have to be a huge spend. It's one of the most affordable ways of getting the word out about what it is you're doing. It's almost like free marketing, almost. Because, it's like if you have something that can entice the journalists who are reaching, New York Post has a readership of 93 million uniques per month. That's significant. The New York Times over 100 million. And so if you can get this story, if the story's right, and you can land those great tier ones in TechCrunch or even in the trades, that can be enough to drive tens of million in revenue just on PR alone. And it's, it'd be ridiculous to not do it, basically. Here's what I've seen from mature brands too. I mean, there's startups and then there's PR from mature brands. A lot of times those sexy, exciting early stage stories have been told. And so what's the news? If you're not rolling out a new product or, what is it you're doing that's interesting now, 5 years in, you've done your funding rounds, which is interesting. You've rolled out 5 new products, which is interesting. And so what now? And in that case, you really have to start thinking about making news instead of just telling news, because the news telling may not be as readily available. So how do you make the news? And one of my favorite examples is from my time at Hipcamp. We were launching in Canada. I'd done, the kind of traditional PR route, gone to the trade publications and the business, business and tech publications, and even local travel, and said, hey, Hipcamp's coming into Canada, and here's what it means for Canadian landowners, and here's what it means for Canadian campers. And we got, a dozen hits, which is fine and not great, but fine. And so we realized we really need to have a story making moment here. So we put together Canada's Best Summer Job, which is a video contest. And we ask Canadians in 90 seconds or less, tell us why you should win $20,000 and the chance to travel coast to coast, camping and glamping at Hipcamp's most epic stays along the way. We got so many entries, close to 500,000 votes. And those were leads that we could then nurture. And we were all over. We had over 400 media hits. We were on TV, radio, syndicated online publications, print. And there were multiple storytelling moments throughout that campaign. There was the launch of the program. There was the finalist announcement where we're, incentivizing local, like the hometown news publications to rally votes for their local hero. There was the finalist announcement. And then once they were traveling across the country, it was like, hey, the winners of Canada's Best Summer Job are now in Ontario, and they're staying at this Hobbit-inspired, Hipcamp. And you should, totally check it out. And they did, And so it was the gift that kept on giving. It was just such a creative and fun approach, and it drove so much media coverage. And I had one of my Canadian colleagues call me and say, my parents are like sitting having lunch and they just saw, heard about Hipcamp. It's like the story of America's or Canada's Best Summer Job is like, they're watching it in their living room as they're having lunch on their TV. And I thought that was so cool. So yeah, sometimes it's about getting really creative and making the news when it's not readily available. It can be an investment, but it's an investment that really pays off in terms of awareness and ultimately bookings in the case of Hipcamp.
That's such a fantastic way of making the news. And I love how it has multiple phases that go out on the wires. How do you make sure it doesn't flop? So if I were planning this, my biggest fear would be, I'm going to announce this $20,000 and 5 people are going to sign up and we have to give away $20,000 for 5 people. How do you make sure the news actually gets out?
You can't, sadly.
Hire Lydia. Lydia.
Hire me. Let's see. I think it's really important to set guardrails. And those can even be as simple as baked into terms and conditions. And maybe it's like, if we don't have, 20 entries by a certain date, the campaign is therefore canceled. And I think there's really something to as excited as I might be about a campaign and selling it in, there's also the business reality. And some of my sweetest and best ideas have never gotten off the ground because I couldn't get the buy-in of the finance team. But I know in my bones, these would work. Please let me do it. And so, man, I'm thinking of one right now, which I really wanted to run for Mental Health Awareness Month in May for Hipcamp. And it was called Everybody Outside, America's Biggest Camp Out. And the idea was a giveaway of 10,000 camping trips at Hipcamps across the U.S. Denny's has done this very successfully. It was actually my inspiration for the idea because Denny's has a free pancake day. And every year it drives massive coverage. And, I know from some of our partnerships that the redemption rate for massive giveaways like this is actually, is actually quite low. And so it's a low risk, venture, but one where the risk is inherently tied to the reward. Because what if you did have 10,000 brand new people download the app and go out and try this for the first time and half of them stuck around? What's the lifetime value of those campers off of a $15 a night camping site? It's very high. And it's a campaign that's kind of designed. Sadly, I was never able to convince finance. Yeah. So how do you guarantee success? You can't, but I think you do have to have those guardrails in place that take into account like the business reality. And think ahead, like, how do I get as creative as possible with this campaign to make sure that it keeps working for us in terms of like the leads that it would generate, or how do I make the case for this, thinking about lifetime value of new app downloads or new bookings or something like that? And is it a case that I can get buy-in from everyone on? So, guardrails are certainly an important part of this process, because you can't think you have a great idea, go out, be reckless, and, and then it flops and, tough stuff, so you gotta have a good plan to back up the great ideas, I think.
I love that way of structuring the costs to go up with the actual intended outcome, so they go in parallel. And it brings me to something I was very curious to understand, which is the ROI. When I think about ROI from a marketing standpoint, I often think more about what we call above the line ATL, where it's like a brand campaign. The intention is to drive the brand, not necessarily direct ROI, and they have more performance, or below the line, where the intention is to close a sale and track an attribution, that sort of thing. A lot of what I would think about as PR would be more like above the line, versus some of these things you're describing are below the line. They're driving conversions, downloads of the app. How do you think about measuring ROI? And do you think about it in a similar way, or is it different?
I do think about it in a similar way. And I really think about it in terms of how do we use this? There are multiple ways to measure PR, like the success of a PR campaign. For some people, many people, it is as simple as I want to drive sales. How do we tell our story in a way that's going to increase awareness to the right audience to the point that they want to buy from us? Other people may have, you could kind of softer goals around brand awareness, but you can also it's not some ephemeral thing. It's 100%. If you're doing a PR play to increase brand awareness and increase, consideration, like let's measure that. Let's benchmark that. Let's understand, because it's really hard to justify a year's worth of PR spend to your board if you can't point to anything like any meaningful, you could say we got a handful of hits. No, I think you've got to look at, we drove a 5% increase in brand awareness across North America. The volume of media coverage we got, the sentiment was 99% positive. Our competitors was 76% positive. So we can show that people are more likely to think about us in terms of the brand values that we care about than they were before we ran this campaign. So there are those kind of less connected directly to sales ways of thinking about PR success. And I like the work of measuring, like, can we drive a 400% year-over-year increase in earned media coverage like we did at Hipcamp? That's a solid goal. But sometimes it is just about, hey, we want to drive sales, and we know that PR is a lever we can pull that will get us those results. And those are my favorite kinds of campaigns, because it usually means there's something really cool for us to go and do storytelling around.
And that brings me to the idea of negative PR. You mentioned like maybe our competitor has 70% positive. A lot of the PR that we see in the media, like thinking of TV shows like Scandal, is very much about negative PR and handling negative PR.
Yeah.
How do you think about that side of the industry?
Yeah. Crisis comms. I think there are 3 foundational rules for great crisis comms, which are own it from the top, apologize, and overcorrect. And if you can nail those 3 things, then you will very quickly move back to a good place. I have a couple of kind of discrete examples here. One is obviously Budweiser, huge debacle. They've lost over 1.3 billion in sales. And the story there is obviously they partnered. There was this kind of Harvard grad who came in and decided that Budweiser drinkers are fratty and out of touch. And even though it's the leading brand in America, we need to take a more progressive tack. And so she partnered with a trans activist, Dylan Mulvaney, and that did not go over well with the base. And, and the company was unwilling to apologize. And I understand the reasons for that. But because they didn't want to alienate either their conservative base or the maybe more progressive community who was backing Dylan Mulvaney, they didn't offer ownership on either side to either audience. They alienated all possible consumers, and they lost shelf space, and their sales tanked, and people boycotted the brand. And they kept thinking, oh, we'll bounce back from this. And they've gone back to their old way of marketing, but they've never apologized. And the brand damage is irreversible, it seems, because they've sunk, they lost their place as America's favorite beer. A quick example from my personal experience, I was working with a marketplace, and we had just built out the company's first crisis comms plan. And about a week later, the company had its first fatality. And unfortunately, it was a young child. And knowing the fundamentals of great crisis communications, the first thing you want to do is obviously own it from the top. And we talked about the brand values around safety and all of the ways that we care about and think about and communicate safety with both sides of the marketplace. And then there's apologize, right? That's the second one. In this case, because of, any crisis comms requires very close communication with your lawyers. And in this case, apologizing would have been accepting, a liability the company was unwilling/unable to. And so we couldn't apologize, but we could express empathy and sympathy, and we could overcorrect. And we did that through rolling out an entirely new kind of safety training course that was new to the industry, that nobody had done before, that would still help the company seem and be responsive to this crisis without creating too much exposure legally. And so, you have these fundamentals. How you go about executing them depends on the complexities of the situation, but there's always a way forward, and not addressing it or not owning it from the top, as Budweiser failed to do, can do fatal damage or lasting damage to debilitating damage to a brand.
What do you see as the common principles between crisis PR and, I'm not sure the right term for both, steady state PR?
Common principles between, well, a first and very obvious one is ownership from the top. It's really hard to run a successful campaign without CEO buy-in. What I've experienced a lot of times is you've got a marketing leader who gets it, who's so bought in, who wants to do it. And then you have a CEO or even a CMO who says, well, yeah, I believe it's all good. I believe in PR. I'm willing to write this, $15,000 check every month. Unless it's a tier one, I'm just not available. I can't make the time on my calendar for an interview or something like that. I think in both crisis comms and steady state PR, having the CEO, having that buy-in from the top is so important. It's far easier to sell an interview with the leader of a company than it is to sell an interview with a mid-level manager. So if you don't have that buy-in from the top and you've created all of these opportunities for the brand and they're kind of just too busy to buy in, then your campaign is probably not going to get the results that you would hope for. And in some cases, what you really have to go out and do, especially if the big tier ones have been told, but there's still an opportunity to reach just as many people with a grassroots campaign, you do have to go out to those podcasts, YouTube channels, trades that have 50,000 readers or, 20,000 subscribers, and they're exactly who your target is. And so they're actually more sticky, juicy, what's the right? They're better opportunities. But maybe they're not as sexy, but they're strong. And what I have seen that's really interesting is if you can do enough of those, then you become relevant to the conversation again. And then when the tier ones are looking at the landscape and saying, okay, who's doing anything interesting? Who are the relevant players? They see this groundswell of interest around your brand, and they're like, let me choose that. Let me reach out to them. I'm with CNN Underscored, and I'm going to reach out to them for an interview about, X, Y, or Z. And that's a best case scenario. And it's but you really have to have buy-in. You have to trust that process. Sometimes you do get those massive, wins right out the gate. Other times it's a process of creating the news. Other times it's a process of laying that foundation of great kind of grassroots storytelling that will then create new opportunities in the future.
And if you're sowing those seeds at smaller publications, how do you know the difference between this is going to go nowhere and I should decline this interview, or this may or may not go somewhere and I should take this interview?
Yeah, I think it's almost always worth taking the interview. And here's why. The newsrooms in America have shrunk by over 20% since before the pandemic. There are fewer journalists working more stories than ever before. And since the advent of AI and PR, what I've heard from journalists is their inbox went from 100 pitches a day to 500 plus pitches a day. Good luck, And what I'm also hearing from journalists when I reach out to them is, well, which affiliate network do you work with? And I've literally heard back from a journalist with Rolling Stone who told me recently, the only way that I can get my editor to assign me to this story is if there's a way for us to make money on it. So there's something really interesting happening. And this shift toward, editorial teams are desperate to break even. And if you can find a way if you can find an opportunity as an agency for your client to speak to a journalist who's not charging you in some way through it, through an affiliate program or something else, and you're aligned on what the objective is, then it's take the interview and let this be. And you can atomize that content in so many different ways, and you can turn it into social posts. You can it helps. It's that social proof point that's very helpful when people are considering. There are lots of ways that earned media is useful, even if you do the work of saying like, hey, here are 2 or 3, really punchy sentences that we can extract and use in our own marketing efforts. So, I will say if your BS meter is going off, then you should probably just fire your agency altogether and come work with us. Okay. Because I remember when I was at Apple, I was at this B2B SaaS division, and we had an agency who'd been with the company for like 20 years, and their lineup of PR coverage included getting us, into IT Briefcase. Have you ever heard of IT Briefcase?
I have never heard of IT Briefcase.
1,500. Oh, I shouldn't bash IT Briefcase, but I'm not. They're a small publication, okay? 1,500 readers. So it may be like a friends and family kind of a deal, and just not relevant, not read, not meaningful.
Yeah.
And so I, had the sad job of firing that PR agency who'd been around. I was leading global PR and comms for the brand, and I brought in a great agency who really took the time to understand our business, what it was we were doing that was innovative. And they were able to go out and, within the first quarter, we were in like CNBC, TechCrunch, those types of publications, because they had the will, the curiosity, the understanding of the industry to make those hits happen. So yes, if there's a case where you're being surfaced opportunities for interviews that are going to reach 500 people or 1,500 people, then I think that's probably a good signal to go and work with someone who can be a little bit more creative, or, pause your PR spend until you and your agency are aligned that there's really a moment worth talking about, or a set of moments worth talking about.
And going deeper on the affiliate piece, that was something that struck me as an interesting thread. I'm not familiar with the term. What is affiliate in this context?
Yeah. So affiliate marketing is essentially, we will pay you, the publisher, $2 or $50 for every booking we get. And if there's, a cancellation, we'll claw back only 30 of the $50. So it's a financial incentive for the company to the publication to talk about your brand. There are a few, I'll say, non-financially incentivized reviewers out there. New York Times Wirecutter is one of them. They don't do affiliate marketing at all. There are pretty much any listicle you ever read has an affiliate payout. And so they're writing, top 25 gifts for her for 2025, for Valentine's Day. And the publisher's getting a kickback from each of those brands. And so it could fall into paid marketing, or it could fall into PR. I think increasingly it's falling into PR. And then you also have another tier, which is it's kind of performance-based marketing in a way, because you pay each time, not each time someone even purchases, but each time they click. That's kind of risky business, but some of the big tier ones, Parenting Magazine, Reader's Digest, USA Today, will offer hey, we'll write a great feature on you in exchange for, you paying us $1.50 or $2 every time someone clicks and drives traffic to your sites. It's a very quickly evolving space with lots of different interesting players. And it's something that I'm continuing to learn about and trial with various clients. It's an interesting space.
It's a fascinating space. And it does, like you said, start to blend the lines between PR and marketing.
Yeah, totally.
That's quite interesting. Going back to the negative PR piece.
Yeah.
How do you avoid a interview backfiring? Like, what if you have a CEO who's wonderful, but not very good at engaging with the media and has some blunder? How do you avoid that going off in the wrong direction?
I think great media training is so important. I've coached brilliant CEOs of multi-billion-dollar brands who just seem very low energy, and I need to push them, bring text the energy as you normally would in a normal conversation. You've got a great, very charismatic personality that's like winning over your investors and like working for your board and everything, but like you need to bump that up and obviously this is not about an error, right? It's just about like presentation, but good media training, making sure that they are really disciplined in the fundamentals of brand communications, that it's not unusual to see a CEO take an answer that should be 3 minutes and turn it into a 15-minute ramble. And there goes half your interview time. And maybe the area the journalist was most interested in, that's most relevant to their audience, you just never get there because they're talking too long. And so it's coaching to keep your answers, if it's a written interview, then like 2 to 3 minutes. If it's a broadcast, you're going to be on TV, 10 to 15 seconds. How do you get as crisp and tight as possible so that the flow continues and it really is a conversation versus a monologue?
That sounds incredibly difficult, to have 10 to 15 seconds to say an answer to a question. Do people learn that quickly, or does it take years to be good at doing?
I think it takes years. I do think that mock interviews help a lot, and recording a mock interview immediately after interview training really helps people understand how much work they have to do and helps them take it very seriously. And then you come back, several days later, you run through again. Hopefully they've been doing their homework and practicing, and then you run it again. And you will quickly see, these are smart people, successful people, and they understand that there's some work to put in to get crisp and tight and effective.
Which, by the way, I've found fascinating in doing this podcast also. There are certain words that you don't realize that I say all the time until I go through and edit the podcast. And I realize, why did I say that 15 times in 1 hour? The biggest most recently is I realized in editing a recent episode, every single question I say, that's interesting, and then move on to the rest of my question.
Oh.
And it was interesting, but I didn't need to repeat that every single time.
Have you adjusted for that? I'm not sure. I think I've heard it a couple of times, but I don't think I've heard it every time.
Not every time. I've slightly adjusted, and I've also relied on editing afterwards.
Smart. That's great.
I want to take this. Actually, where do I want to take this next? Oh, I'd love to take in this direction. If you were brand new to PR, or let's say a founder who's brand new to PR, doesn't have the budget yet to hire an actual PR person, what are the things they could do to start dabbling in this area of the business?
You can learn, almost anything thanks to the old Googs. Google around and search how to write a great pitch. Subscribe to Muckrack. It's my favorite PR tech tool out there. It's essentially a massive database of journalists and with all of their contact information at the ready. It's somewhat pricey, but they've got a lot of free courses, certifications, and resources like newsletters and webinars you can attend and things like that. So I would start to just try to wrap your head around the fundamentals of things like pitching, how to know, how to build a media list to send your pitch to, how to think about the right length for a pitch. As a founder, so much information and there's so many things you want to say, and the journalist is getting 500 pitches a day, and they can scan through and then they're on. They don't have time to read your several paragraphs. I got a Hipcamp into Forbes off of a 1-paragraph pitch. It was like 2 or 3 sentences. And I didn't explain or describe every aspect of the product. I just said, hey, here's what we're rolling out. Here's what it means to people who love dark skies. The end. And we got a great in-depth product feature in Forbes about it. And then we've also gotten multiple hits throughout the years since from that one journalist. So there's so much great information out there. And then it's just the trial and error of you take this information and you think you have an instinct that hey, this might be an interesting storytelling moment for the brand. Let me go out and see what I can do as the founder, as the CEO, in reaching 5 or 10 journalists with a pitch that I feel pretty confident about and see what the results are. And you might get something. And if not, look for an agency that's willing to work on a project basis. It doesn't have to be insanely expensive. It can be a $5,000 or $10,000 a month investment for 3 months, and you get to drive the sales you're hoping for out of that engagement. There are a lot of agencies that'll charge $35,000 a month, $100,000 a month, and it's a year-long contract with a 90-day out. You don't need that, especially as early stage. But working on a project basis and really proving the value of that relationship, and making sure you have an agency who gets what it is you're doing and why it's relevant, and who themselves can answer, why is this relevant now? The why now question, which is always so important. If you find that kind of a partnership, then it would be worth, I would challenge this assumption that like, oh, we don't have money for PR. It's like, if you've got $5,000 a month, that you can spare for 3 months, you probably should afford PR because it can really help. So
I love that flipping of it. Not can I, it's should you. And it's interesting too how it is a flywheel, that if you start landing these entries, some of those same journalists will come back again and again, and you start to build a reputation.
That's right.
How would you think about building PR internally in-house versus hiring an agency?
I think someone who's working on this, living and breathing it full time in-house, who's connected to the data, who knows your system, who knows your team, who can reach out to your head of design to help with a campaign, or your head of marketing to get the data you need for a certain market like that in response to a journalist query. That's probably always going to be the best option, to have somebody who's got ownership of it. But it's also not the reality that you can pay, off a year for like a great in-house PR person. So in that case, it can really make sense to do project-based work, or to hire a PR agency who can show you a great plan for 6 months, not just what they've done in the past, but what can they do for you? How would they approach it? They can really map it out. They see the opportunities. They can tell you the campaigns they would run. Who's willing to put that level of thinking and work in. And I will say this, for global brands, even though I brought PR at Hipcamp in-house and we saw just a massive increase in the volume of earned media we were able to drive, I always worked with local agencies in other markets, in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, same at Apple, because there are nuances to language, how to frame a certain story, sensitivities, things to avoid, that as good as you are in the US, or as if you're an incredible Canadian PR person, you're just not going to be able to nail it in an Australian market. And so I always think it's worth it to get localized PR support for global brands. Always, always worth it. And it doesn't have to be a massive retainer. What I like to do is build the strategy in-house and lead the agencies globally to execute against it in their own ways, to execute that localized approach. And that's how you ensure, again, it's really hard for a US PR agency that's handling multiple brands to be able to fully own the core strategy for a brand and lead other agencies. Like, that's almost an it's setting everyone up for a lot of frustration and even failure. It's much better to have an in-house person setting the strategy and then managing global teams. And I think that's a structure that I would always recommend.
I'd love to go deeper into hiring. So you had your first Mariah Creatives, you hired 6 people, then you were at Apple, you hired other agencies. Let's maybe start with people. How do you find great people to hire into a PR agency?
Yeah. I am like, for Attentio PR, we just, our first hire, I'm actually meeting with her at noon. We've got some contractors, but she's our first full-time hire and she's been onboarded, and so it's really exciting. But we posted the director of PR role that we hired her for about 4 weeks ago. And I posted it to LinkedIn. I got about over 130 entries in about 12 hours. And we had priced, it's like competitive salary. And I looked through that stack. I wanted to take the time to look through every single entry. And I found 20 people who, based on their experience and their resume, were a fit. What I was really looking for was people who were capable of quantifying the impact of their work. And it's not enough to just say that I was responsible for X, Y, and Z. I did X, Y, and Z. Who cares? So what? I really want people who understand how to think about the impact. I executed these 5 campaigns for this client, for Dove, and here's the impact. We saw a 20% lift in direct traffic. We saw, 5% lift in brand awareness. We saw, and when I see that, I'm like, okay, this is someone who can think the right way. From there, we had we reached out to all of those people. We had 13 people get back to us within a 48-hour period. And that's something that I'm looking for too, is like responsiveness, because I understand people are busy. They've got a lot of stuff going on. And also if they can't make the time to respond to an email, how are they going to handle rapid fire queries from journalists? If you send out a pitch to 50 journalists and 10 of them get back to you, and you've got to prep media briefing docs for your CEO, and you've got to respond to that journalist, you've got to get them the assets that they want, the B-roll, the photos, the data that they want. It is full on. And so I need somebody who's responsive, right? So we got then 13. We interviewed those 13 and decided to move 5 forward to a second round of interviews, which is project-based. And the reason we eliminated the other ones were because they didn't have what we call like a fire in your belly. They didn't have an intensity. General Mattis is a really famous Marine Corps general, former Secretary of Defense, and he says, live life with intensity and a passion for excellence. And I really want to be able to sense that and feel that. If someone's representing the company that I'm building, I want to be able to sense that intensity, to see the excellence in their, the way they're communicating. And if it doesn't exist, then it's not going to be a fit. And I wish them well somewhere else. And then it was interesting in the final 5, Naroon, she's our new hire, really stood out because of how thorough her research was. And again, it's like that is core to our success, is great research. And she brought in some iconic images for her project. She brought in some iconic images from the LA fires. There's this one image of like a lab who's silhouetted against the flames, and he's nestled up to a firefighter. And it was this really compelling story about, all of the displaced animals and animals left behind during the fire. And one of our clients she was preparing the presentation for her project for is called Sniff Spot. And they have turned 29,000 backyards across the US into private dog parks that you can rent by the hour through their app. And so Eva had this great idea for a Sniff Spot campaign in LA. And just like that kind of like highly relevant, research-based, it's taking her project and answering the why now question. She was just a standout for her thoroughness and her creativity. And we also had a candidate, interestingly, who was spent the entire interview typing the questions we were asking him into ChatGPT and then reading from the screen, which was really unsettling and so obvious too. And he would say phrases like, it's not just about relationships, it's about results. And I asked, are you like typing things into ChatGPT and like reading them back to us? And he's like, oh, I am, I just, I feel like it's a fast way to get to the right answer. And I was like, it's one way to get to an answer. And yeah, he was an interesting guy. He was qualified in a lot of ways, but it wasn't a fit. So we're happy to feel very lucky for it. So
that is quite exciting. And yeah. I am curious, going back to a number of years ago when you hired the first 6 people at your original Mariah Creatives, what has changed in how you hire from then to now?
I think not much. I mean, I'm looking for outstanding work. I'm looking for a really strong track record of results. I think if there's one thing that's changed, it's that I am more thorough in one of the things Eva brought to the table that I really liked, and that are actually our top 2 candidates, and we'll probably hire the other one at the beginning of Q2. What they both brought to the table was a list of references. I didn't ask them for these references, but they had letters of recommendation that they presented along with their resume and project. They had phone numbers and people who could speak on their behalf and speak to their work. So they were coming to the table not just with like incredible thinking and really compelling pitches and like great creativity, but also essentially like character witnesses, which is so helpful. I mean, this is a big deal to hire someone. And I think, before it was enough to know, hey, this person's responsive. They do incredible work, and I know I can work with really anybody. But now it's also like, okay, well, what do people who've worked with them for the past decade have to say? And like, that's such an important piece of it too. And I was really impressed to dive into those references and resources and get a sense of how does this person show up on a daily basis? And it does remove a level of risk when you're hiring. That's for sure.
It does. And then to pivot to the agency side,
Yeah.
how do you hire a good agency? And how do you avoid an agency that's just going to spin their wheels?
Yeah, what I've heard again and again as I've pitched, and I've been on both sides of the table, but I think what I've heard again and again as like the reason people have chosen to work with me through the years with Attentio now is I'm not only telling them what I would do, but how. What do those first 10 stories look like? I understand what they're trying to accomplish, and I show them how we're going to get there. And that takes a lot of work to get there. And I think a lot of times when you're dealing with bigger agencies who have, they're 50-person agencies or something like that, they have enough of a track record that it's just like, hey, throw in your money and hope for the best, But you may have a very charismatic salesperson who hands you down to somebody, who's getting paid $17 an hour, and good luck. So I think it comes down to, is the agency really taking time to understand why your brand, your product, your service is relevant? And can they come back to you a week or so later then with a plan that says, here's how we're going to take this really awesome story you have and like bring it to the world? And they can explain that plan in detail. And that, like, you should have a lot of confidence if you have an agency who gets it enough and believes in it and has enough of a work ethic to build out that plan for you. And when I've been hiring agencies, that is absolutely something I'm looking for, is what's the plan? Show it to me. Let's talk through it. Let's get aligned. And like, if they can do that early on, then like it's a pretty safe.
And how much time would you spend investing in building this plan? The fear to me is like, okay, I spend 20 hours building a plan and I close 1 in 10 deals. I've wasted a lot of time that I'm never going to get back.
Yeah. Well, I think that's just the risk of doing business. I think what helps is like a lot of the clients that come to us, thankfully, I did a breakdown of this actually last year. I think it's something like 80% of our clients come to us through word of mouth and referrals. And so we're not one of a dozen agencies they're looking at. They've been referred to us as like, we're a great agency. And now it's our job to show them, how can we make your brand sing? And so it's been worth the investment to do that. There have been a time, recently we had this really interesting client in the VR and AR space ask us to build out a proposal, say they needed an agency. They've been referred to us. I put in the time, I did all the research, I built a beautiful deck, and then they couldn't close their bridge round. And therefore, we're trying to raise, I think, 15 million, therefore could not move forward. And it was a bummer, but it was also like, okay, I now know way more about this industry. So it was a worthy of an investment of my time, because if I ever get a client coming across in this space, I almost have like a template for what a smart approach would be. I know the lay of the land. So I think of it as an investment in my own learning on the rare occasions that does happen.
That is wonderful. Back to that analogy of a moving ship, you can direct more easily.
Yes.
So you've been a journalist, you've been a internal comms person, and you've also been an external agency. What has drawn you back to the agency world at this point?
I think it's variety. I'm pretty sure I have like ADHD, like the same thing that I loved about my job in the Marine Corps, which is like that constant flow of adventure. You've got the fundamental of storytelling. It's what I feel so lucky to be able to make a living with words, but I love to work on a variety of projects. And I love the challenge of constantly learning and trying new things and working with just a range of people. So, I think it's you kind of, after a few years with a brand, 3 or 4 years with a brand, you've told the stories there are to tell. You've put your best creative thinking in, you've run great campaigns. And maybe there's, you're in a situation where it's like, we're not going to launch a new country this year. We haven't, we're not doing much on the product side. So at that point, you're kind of recycling the things that work, and you can do it and you can get the results, but like, where's the challenge? And so I think that's what's fun about working with the variety of clients. Like right now, we've got a ton of marketplace clients, but also, clients in AI and mobility innovation, just almost industry agnostic. As long as they're doing interesting things, then I've got an interesting job.
That is a ton of fun. It brings back those moments of playing Scrabble on an airplane above the Sahara. What, or how rather, do you manage across all these different competing priorities? So for instance, what if you have two clients that have big stories landing at the same time? How do you make the time work in a single day?
Yeah. I think a good network of contractors is critical. There's some work that only I can do, but not much of it. Most of it, if I have smart, talented people who are great communicators, I can farm out a lot of, put together a briefing doc. Here's a journalist, here's a client, go. I can outsource a lot of that work. I like to use the Eisenhower matrix, which is for decision making when I'm kind of planning out my day. And that is, urgent, not urgent, important, not important, bucket the stuff in. And then I work on like the urgent and important stuff. I also use this every day. I promise I didn't have it for, you can read it, the Full Focus Planner.
So cool.
And this helps me outline my weeks. What are my top 3 priorities for the week? How do those map to my annual goals? What are my top 3 priorities per day? And then the other tasks. And it's celebrating at the end of every single day. What's a win? And also, as I look through the week, how can I map out 3 moments of improved investing in communication, self-care, wellness? Because I think it's easy to become so focused on work. But, one of my top 3 priorities is always for my day is always a parenting priority. Because I never want work to be the thing that I'm so focused on that I kind of lose sight of my most important job, which is being a mom. And so whether it's like patience with the kids or like, a walk outside or cooking dinner together or whatever, it's like that has to factor into my day too. I know that's totally off topic, but yeah, it's I think outsourcing what you can, being crystal clear on why you're doing the things you're doing, making sure you're only doing the things that only you can do. And I think it's a fine way to manage.
It's amazing. I love that thinking about family as well, because careers are wonderful and they're important and it's great to do interesting, difficult work, but it's not everything. You need the other stuff also.
Yeah, that's right.
That brings us to our lightning round. So I'll throw out a few quick questions.
Okay, I'll try to be disciplined. I'll try 15 seconds or less. Let me see.
It is the 15 seconds. Feel free to do 15, but also feel free to go more as you desire. First question, embargoed launches or surprise announcements?
Embargoed launches for sure. You give the journalist time to write the story. And it's if one does the story, the incentive for the others just drops off a cliff. So it's really best to give a 3-week embargo, ideally. Let the journalists, all the journalists from the tier ones, let them do their interviews, let them put together a great story, let them push it through the editorial process. And then you have this kind of shock and awe moment for the brand. The minute that embargo lifts and you see, dozens of hits, and that's like a dream for everybody. So yeah, for sure. Embargo.
That sounds like a very exciting moment. Long lead features or quick news hits?
Long lead features. That's a mystery to me. I just think it's a bunch of shenanigans. I mean, quick news hits. If you got a story, go out and freaking tell it and get the hit. Like this idea that, it takes months to cultivate a relationship. No, if you have a story, it sells. If you don't have a story, I don't know. To me, it feels like Bigfoot. Like everybody talks about it. Supposedly people have seen it. But like it really exists,
Yes. Data-driven narratives or human interest angles?
Both. A beautiful marriage of the two. That little boy in his pumpkin patch, that's, looking through high growth market. Cool. Oklahoma is it. It's Hipcamp's taking off. How do we accelerate growth by telling this incredible story of this little boy whose dad died of cancer and who's created this pumpkin patch? And so it's a marriage of the two. The best are the marriage of the two.
Put the two together. Traditional media or online influencers?
Well, traditional media is free mostly, and online influencers you're paying. So I like free. Yeah, the creator economy, influencer economy is interesting, but I'm going to go for traditional because you've got the reach, the visibility. You can really target audiences for the most part, even with online. Outside of affiliate plays, you get your story in, and the only fee you're paying is for your agency, which can be on par with what you might pay a single creator to do. So I'm going to go for traditional media. Yeah.
AI assisted writing or human crafting alone?
Again, I think a hybrid. AI helps me iterate and get to interesting ideas quickly, but I've also seen the inner workings of an AI, fully AI powered PR agency that's incredible, but I've seen it flop because AI cannot yet get to the heart of a story. And it understands how to stack facts, but not how to add just the right context to create questions and interest. So can it lay out the facts? Yes. Are they the right facts in the right order with the right context? No, not yet. That may change soon, but I like AI to get me to help me iterate quickly, but ultimately the responsibility for great storytelling, the right research comes down to me.
The human and the machine together.
The human. Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
Well, that ends our interview. Where can people go to find out more about you and about your agency?
AttentioPR.com. Attentio means attention in Latin. And that's what we try to aim to do is grab attention for the world's most interesting brands. And then I would also encourage people to follow me on LinkedIn. Really love transparency. And I regularly recommend other incredible PR agencies who I've known and worked with through the years. I may not be the right fit for everybody, but if you are a B2B SaaS product, I know exactly who be good PR. I know exactly who to refer you to. If you're going to Australia and you're a consumer product, it's going to be Aruga, which is just an incredible PR agency, like world-class PR agency in Australia. So hit me up if you need references, referrals. I have a great little network of outstanding agencies I've personally worked with and really trust and appreciate a lot.
That's amazing. Well, all of that will be in the show notes below. Thank you for coming on the show, Lydia.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.